modern civilization is one civilization, and it's a bizarre civilization relative to previous civilizations. We've always thought in Europe that somehow or other we are the culmination of all previous civilizations, and that therefore we are the greatest civilization of all. We're just beginning to think, well, maybe we're not, yeah? And I really want to show us that is absolute rubbish, that civilizations have been going for an awful long time, and there have been civilizations like Egypt that lasted 3,000 years, that were organized in a particular way. It was a slave society, and that had its own obsession. And most civilizations have some central obsession, and the central obsession of this civilization was that the kings should have a good time in the afterworld, and they built huge monuments and huge tombs and so on and so forth to ensure that that happened, including these incredible pyramids, these perfect pyramids that were built 5,000 years ago. Fast forward. I'm not going to say, talk about many civilizations, but I think 3 is enough. Let's just talk about our own civilization, or let's say what went before our present civilization here in Northern Europe, yeah? Okay, it was a civilization that had a very intricate socio-economic formation that we call feudalism, and its obsession was building vast cathedrals like this, including here in Vienna, yeah, and scattering churches all over the landscape to the greater good of God, whoever that was. And then we come to modern civilization, and well, let's say that it started 300 or 400 years ago. It started to get going. 17th century, we can begin to recognize the form that it's subsequently taken. And what's our obsession? Our obsession is everything has to change. Progress. We have to move. We can't stand still. We've got to move. We're going somewhere. And previously, we always thought we were going in a great direction. So 17th century, we said the kind of idea was the perfectibility of man. So somehow or other, man was going to be perfected through the progress of European civilization. And then at the beginning of the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century, we changed gear. We changed gear, and we decided that actually progress was a matter of wealth. We were going to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. Yeah? And then into the 20th century, not only was it wealth, but it was consumption, to consume, and to consume. Yeah? We find we've got this civilization which is just bizarre in what is actually going on around us, and the way that it is moving forward day to day in directions that we've no idea where it's going. Yeah? Okay, now all civilizations come to an end at some stage. Yeah, well, we've been going 300 years. Well, somehow or other the Egyptians went for 3,000 years, and so on and so forth. And how did they come to an end? Well, a book was published in 1988, written by an anthropologist who looked into the whole issue of how do civilizations collapse. Yeah? So it's called the collapse of he called it collapse of complex societies. And, well, do they all go the same way? Well, not really. They all collapse in different ways. But he did find there was a tendency within so many civilizations that as they got more complex, so they kind of ran out of an ability to manage that complexity. And it might come from a lack of ideas. They just, they came to the end of their imagination with regard to how do you manage a complex society, or they ran out of money, like in ancient Rome. They couldn't fund the army anymore, or the bureaucracy, or they ran out of food because they overused the earth, if we go to the Maya civilization in Central America, and each of them collapsed around what we economists would tend to call diminishing returns. In other words, the cost of actually maintaining, or the cost, and I'm saying in different ways, the cost of maintaining it was simply too much. And civilizations, as it were, go bankrupt, you can call it that way. So what about our own civilization? Yeah? So what's going to happen to it? And I think everybody knows. Yeah, we all know, but we don't want to think about it. So we kind of put it off, and we read a little bit about it, and so on and so forth. We think, well, somehow or other, we'll manage to make it continue to work. Yeah? And so I'm going to go into and point out, in words of one syllable, as it were, where we're at and what the problem is. Yeah? And where we're at is that, when I talked about changing gear at the beginning of the 19th century, that changing gear was that we discovered how to exploit fossil fuels, and particularly coal to begin with, and then oil, and after that gas, exploit them in order to produce more wealth. Yeah? And so we industrialized, and then we urbanized, and our development went on in this direction, with very few people thinking, well, at some stage, because this is just coming out of the earth, and we won't be able to find any more. But nobody really thought about it. Hardly anybody really thought about it. And the concept that we have to understand that with is the ratio of energy returned. Yeah. The energy returned for energy invested, yeah? And that's known as EROE. Okay, quick illustration. End of the 19th century, they were going around looking for oil, and they found where there were massive amounts of oil, put a drill down into the ground, and shoof, vast quantities of oil came out of the ground, yeah? And therefore, the error of that was, 1 unit of energy would produce 100 or more units of useful energy. And gradually, we found all the places where there was a lot of energy coming out, and gradually the error went down as you had to use more and more energy to get the energy out of the ground, because you were going down long distance under the sea, or wherever it was that you were exploiting it, or there were very small amounts, and so on and so forth. And what we find ourselves in now is that the error is going down and down and down. Therefore, we are spending more and more energy to get less and less useful energy out of the ground. And you can see on this graph perfectly clearly what the situation is. People say, well, nuclear power. Well, just look at nuclear power there, yeah? The error is extremely low. And in fact, if a nuclear power that uses huge amounts of energy to produce it and to run it, let's say, it goes wrong after the first 10 years, then it's negative energy that comes out of the nuclear power station. We can't afford nuclear power, yeah, from the energy point of view. It's a luxury we can't afford. And if you start looking at the renewables, yes, we've got endless amounts of renewables, but the amount of energy it takes to actually get them out of the ground means that this is no solution to our problem. And here we have, well, I've put 4 graphs. I like the one on the top left-hand corner, which shows, from 1600 on, that the whole world was using virtually no energy until almost the 19th century, and then whips, suddenly it goes through the roof, and then we can see that we're just at the peak of the amount of energy that we're going to have, and it's going down the other side in the coming decades. We're not talking of hundreds of years, we're talking of the coming decades. We are there now. We are going bankrupt energy-wise now. So our whole idea of progress, we are going to regress, we are going to de-develop, and we are going to have less and less wealth. And of course, this sounds like a catastrophe, and this is why you don't want to think about it, because somehow or other, you cannot imagine a world after that. Okay, so the second half of what I want to say is we've always known that there is an alternative, and there are many, many people who've been working towards those alternatives over time who've been ignored. Yeah? And so I'm going to take you back to 1818. Yeah? So the year 1818, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the British economy collapsed. Wars are very good for the economy as long as they're not fought on your territory. And the British economy collapsed, and the British Parliament looked around and said, who can advise us how to get our economy back on track again? And various people came forward. 2 businessmen came forward at different times with very different ideas. The first of them, I just want to mention, is a man called David Ricardo. He was any economists here will know he's one of the, let's say, the fathers of modern economic theory. And he said to Parliament, well, look, don't try to invest further in the United Kingdom, or England as it was then, because we've developed all our resources, and if you go on trying to invest here, you'll get less and less return for it. Yeah? So this is diminishing returns. He's the one who put it in the economics textbooks. He said, what we need to do is trade. Manchester at the time was booming. They were producing cotton cloth and exporting it, and so he said, well, look, we produce what we can do well, and and he took the example of Portugal. They produce wine, so they produce the wine, we'll produce the cloth, we trade, and everybody will benefit. Yeah, and he had a little equation. Yeah. That proved that this was the case, and that's in your economic textbooks. And the Parliament said, what a good idea. And off they went, and so we got the beginnings of globalization and the situation we have now, where the rich countries and people like us, let's say, exploit the resources of the South and the labor of the South in order to live the kind of life that we lead. The second businessman who came along was a certain Robert Owen. Probably very few of the people in the audience know who Robert Owen was, but he was a very important person. In his time, he was very well known. He was a cotton magnate, so he was one of the heroes of David Ricardo, you might say, and made a fortune. But Manchester, when it was growing at that time, had horrendous environmental conditions, and the social conditions were even worse. And although he was a businessman, he said, this is not necessary. And so his advice to Parliament was he said to them, what you should do is you should found smaller towns, small cities or large towns in the countryside and put industry out there with much better environmental conditions, and you must educate the workers so they can run the companies themselves. There's no need for bosses. They're just as intelligent as we are. If they get together cooperatively, they can run industry. Yeah? Parliament took no notice of him. Later in life, he invented trade unionism, modern trade unionism, that was the foundation of social democracy, we have to say that. And he also invented cooperativism. And everybody knows that cooperatives exist, but you don't realize just how many people are involved in cooperatives of one kind or another. The International Cooperatives Alliance, which looks after the interests of cooperatives internationally, reckons there are about 100 million people who are involved in cooperatives of one kind or another, housing cooperatives, productive cooperatives, and so on and so on. Yeah? So it shows that it's a perfectly viable alternative to organizing our world to capitalism. Yeah? No need at all for bosses. You can run it yourself. Yeah? So this was what Owen had to offer. Now, was Owen a lone voice? No, he wasn't a lone voice. There are many, many, many voices who've put forward alternative ways of organizing our society. And I'm going to go right back to the beginning, as it were. This is exactly 500 years ago. The Lord Chancellor of England, or the equivalent of the Prime Minister of England, he could see the seeds of capitalism germinating, and what he saw he didn't like. Yeah? He was a very humanitarian person, you might say. And so he sat down and he wrote a little thought experiment, yeah, that he put in a little book, which is called Utopia. If there's anybody in this room who hasn't read Utopia, read it. Because it's a book that, although it has many odd ideas in it, it also has a lot of wisdom, and it starts you off on the process of saying, well, what kind of a society would we want to have other than the one that we've got now? Huh? And coming after Thomas More, there were many, many, many utopians who, or let's say followers or people who had these kinds of thought experiments and even went out to try to organize society on a different basis. And in the 19th century, as capitalism really got underway, and these environmental conditions and the social conditions that Owen was so disgusted by, yeah, we have to say, there were many people who were discussing these things, and they were known then as utopians, indeed. And I'm only going to mention one more of them, and that is a man by the name of, let's say, a Russian exile because of his ideas. He was a prince, and he was an anarchist. And he sat in London, he wrote many, many books, and I will advise you to read one of his books, which is this, Fields, Factories and Workshops, that is a number of essays that describe what an alternative society will be after the revolution, was the way that he put it, the way that he thought it, in which, well, you don't have to repeat it, as Owen said, we have to educate the people to be able to run the society on their own cooperatively. Yeah? And at the end of his life, he was able to go back to Russia because of the revolution, and he talked with Lenin and why don't you run the Soviet Union on this basis? And unfortunately, Lenin was enjoying his power by then and decided that authoritarian productivism, I mean, that's really what they had in the Soviet Union, authoritarian productivism was the way that we should go. And he went off and organized various cooperatives, and when he died, at his funeral in Moscow, there were about 10,000 people who were at the funeral, and they had demonstrations there, essentially trying to say to Lenin, this is the kind of society we would prefer, rather than the one that, unfortunately, they got. Okay, so what is happening today? Are the people who are thinking about an alternative society, maybe along the lines of Owen and Kropotkin and many others? Of course there are. And particularly since the failed revolution of 1968, many, many young people have come together to form let's say, communities in which they try to live an alternative life. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these things around, and sometimes it's 10 or 20 people, up to about 100 people who've come together, and they've been living now for decades sometimes. And what are their principles? Principles is look after nature, yeah? Ecologically sound ways of doing agriculture, of actually producing things yourself, and above all, how are we going to take decisions in a participatory way so that everybody benefits from the way that we actually live our lives. And this is an illustration of one of them. And I will now talk about, just finally, there are many movements that are starting up as a consequence of realizing that we can't go on the way they are, that as one person put it, the party is over, yeah? So how are we going to reorganize our society? And here are three examples, yeah? It's called the Global Eco-Village Network, yeah? Which exists. There are about 10,000 groups of people around the world in over 100 countries who are organizing themselves in a small way around ideas of how can we live sustainably, how can we actually organize our life in a different kind of a way so that we're not destroying nature, and so that we can take decisions amongst ourselves that are not competitive, but that are in terms of a consensus that will produce a way of life that we want to lead. And some of them are in urban areas, and this one is in London here, almost zero energy use in these houses, yeah? Or they're in suburbia, or they're out in the countryside. Second movement is something which comes under the acronym of CSA. That's community-supported agriculture. This started in Japan in the 1960s, where housewives were very dissatisfied with what they were getting in supermarkets, and so they made common cause with farmers on the outskirts of the cities. So the farmers who would then produce food organically would then provide them with the food that they need. And now there are about 11 million people in Japan who are involved in these kinds of movements that produce about, on average, 60% of the food that they eat. The movement came to Europe in the 80s, 90s, and the United States, and it spread very widely. There's a very, and I'm sure there are people here who are involved in Vienna, because there is a very good network here in Vienna of CSA. And it's spread in Italy or France or the United Kingdom. There are hundreds of these things around, towns and cities where CSA is actually being practiced. And finally, the movement, which maybe is the most important, is a movement which is called the transition movement, that started 10 years ago, in Ireland and in the United Kingdom, and that is explicitly concerned with making a transition out of our current agriculture and the way that we produce our food and the way that we deal with nature, on the one hand, with permaculture. Some of the people probably know what permaculture is. And secondly, the idea of that we've got to reduce the amount of energy ahead of when we're going to have to reduce the amount of energy. And so you get together with a local authority and you produce an energy descent plan. And then there are other activities that the transition movement is helping people into, of reviving the local economy, it's called reconomy, and of organizing yourself in a way that you can take decisions in terms of consensus. So here we are. The movement has been going an awful long time, and essentially, I put you in the picture. If you didn't, what you didn't know, I'm sure everybody knew a little bit about things, and just getting the thing into a clear perspective. So finally, all I have to say is turn to you and say the following. 1, put your car in the garage and lock it up. 2, turn off your television permanently. And 3, take this infernal machine that I'm sure everybody has one of these, that they're living a virtual life rather than a real life, throw it away, because the future is not catastrophic if you decide that it's not going to be catastrophic, but if you decide to participate in what's going on. It's fun. The future is potentially fun if you make it so. So go for it.